Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, where we talk all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. This time, we begin with a quick gameplay-related note since, as you can see, these puppets have now returned. To understand why, let's switch to some footage I have of another character. You probably recall that at the end of my last video, after I defeated these skeletal marionettes, I ran around for about 4 minutes waiting for the monsters to respawn on their own. When they failed to do so, I ended the video and subsequently exited out of the game. Well, I've now recreated that behavior without the 4-minute wait, and as you can see, loading back in returns these puppets to life. This is somewhat unusual for Bloodborne, since quitting and reloading doesn't typically respawn enemies, but it's not as remarkable as what we're about to see after crossing this threshold to deal with the next boss, who's something of a talker.
Cos. Or some say Cosm. Do you hear our prayers? No, we shall not abandon the dream. No one can catch us. No one can stop us now.
In fact, I think he'll find that we can stop him. While we're busy doing that though, let's turn to the translation of his lines. Here, I think the most engaging subject by far is the name he pronounces 2 different ways right at the start. Unfortunately, the thing that makes the subject so interesting is that even though I'm not sure what the original Japanese terms are meant to accomplish, the official English translation involves a set of choices that shift the pronunciation of both names. As my more literal spellings were meant to indicate, in the original, Micolash calls upon Gos or Gosumu, while in English these names have been rendered Kaz and Kazum. These are noteworthy changes, with the voiced G becoming an unvoiced K, and the unvoiced S becoming a voiced Z. And for all that the Japanese versions of Western names can sound very different, there's usually a closer connection than this, which suggests to me that these changes may have been made for another reason. What might that be? Well, all I can do is speculate, but it's possible it has to do with references and associations. I say this because while Gosumu doesn't seem to have any particular meaning in Japanese, except maybe as part of the name of a mountain, Gos does. It's one sound away from the word gosto, which is a loan word for ghost, and it's also reasonably close to gasu, which means gas, and as a result, this is the Japanese name for the Pokemon Ghastly. What's more, it's apparently also the name of a group of aliens from a show in the Ultraman series. So, while I admit this interpretation is something of a stretch, it's possible that Gosu is meant to evoke ideas of an alien, otherworldly creature. If that's true, then perhaps the English sounds were changed to achieve a similar sort of suggestiveness. Before we get to what I think the English names allude to, though, note that this enemy has reanimated after about 1.5 minutes without my reloading. But to return to the subject of alien names, I don't think it's entirely coincidental that Kazum is pronounced identically to the word-forming element Kazum with a C that means world or universe and frequently refers to outer space. Kaz is not only 1 letter away from that, but it also sounds like the word cause, which may also be significant. Or all of this speculation could be completely off base. But even if there is no deeper meaning, and the writers in both English and Japanese simply went with the name-like sounds they thought fit their language best, there is at least one element of these terms that's still important, and it comes through just fine in translation. Namely, that Micolash isn't sure which one of these names is accurate. This gives his whole speech something of a scholarly feel, as if he's not sure which of 2 pronunciations he's read about is correct. It also gets at the idea that the name of a great one, a being worthy of prayer, is difficult for humans to understand and speak properly. Both of these points tie in with conventions of cosmic horror, which I find quite fitting for this part of the game. But I wonder how Micolash feels about us taking him out right there.
Oh, majestic! A hunter is a hunter even in a dream. But alas, not too fast. The nightmare swirls and churns unending.
I guess he's basically unfazed. I, on the other hand, am really impressed with this translation, mostly because I think it does a great job filling in some gaps that are mysterious yet comprehensible in Japanese, but that would be very hard to follow with a literal translation. For instance, consider his comments on the nature of hunters. The original line ends on an implication, with the word for hunter, karyudo, followed by the particle combination towa. Now, you may recall that combination from other episodes where I've mentioned that it often indicates a given term is about to be followed with a definition, but the subsequent statement could also be something the speaker strongly associates with the term. For instance, the example sentence given in my Daijisen Japanese dictionary is "Yūjō to wa kakegai no nai mono da," which translates somewhat directly to "friendship is an irreplaceable thing." Here, yūjō, or friendship, is being identified with the particle towa as the subject the following statement applies to. And while not strictly a definition, an irreplaceable treasure is certainly a phrase that someone might use to describe friendship. So, in Bloodborne, Micolash is basically saying that even in a dream, our hunter is behaving in a way that he finds typical of hunters. Except in this case, he's leaving that behavior unspoken. To get at this idea in my more literal translation, I've left this as a trailing sentence. Even in a dream, you hunters... By contrast, the official translation is able to get across the same idea of our hunter behaving typically with a more natural phrase. A hunter is a hunter, even in a dream. Not only that, note that the exact behavior that Micolash is alluding to remains unspecified. In other words, the official translation is able to naturally complete the sentence while making the same unclear statement about the nature of hunters as the Japanese. I think this is a great solution to a tricky problem, and I feel similarly about the next line as well, even if the official translation might seem like more of a change. In the original, Micolash is just saying, but you see, and that sounds quite different from, but alas, not too fast. When you think about it though, the purpose both versions serve is actually quite similar. Remember, this whole dialogue is Mikolash's way of asserting his superiority despite the beating we just gave him. That's why he starts by laughing at us and praising our efforts. He's basically saying, you may be a hunter, but we're in a nightmare, so I have nothing to fear from you. Given that overall idea, the important thing this line needs to convey is the reversal that follows up his statement of, a hunter is a hunter even in a dream. Here, the official phrasing not only does this, but it gets across Mikolash's sense of superiority as well. It's like a more verbose version of him saying, in a way that fits his character, and I see it as another example of the translator staying faithful to the intent of the line by doing some interpretation and recreating it in English. I think this is one of this translation team's great strengths, and it's one reason why I think the lines from this fight are so iconic. Having said that though, there is one interpretive decision in his cycling dialogue that I'm puzzled by. Let's hear it.
Of course. Some say cousin. Do you hear our prayers, as you once did for the vacuous Rome? Grant us eyes, grant us eyes. Plant eyes on our brains to cleanse our beastly idiocy. A grand lake of mud, hidden now from sight. The cosmos, of course. Let us sit about and speak feverishly, chatting into the wee hours of new ideas of the higher plane.
Such enlightened words. Anyway, the one piece of that dialogue I'm unsure of is when Micolash suddenly brings up the cosmos. Technically, in Japanese, he just says the word for outer space and then emphasizes it using the particle yo. But there is a chance he could be using a grammatical form of address, as if he were appealing to the cosmos. Meanwhile, the official "of course" makes it sound like a sudden revelation, and I'm not entirely sure where that comes from. Besides that, though, I think his dialogue is great, including these dying words.
Oh, now I'm waking up. I'll forget everything.
Right, we'll leave him to wake up as a mummified corpse. Meanwhile, let's talk about what he's waking up from. You may have noticed that in my more literal translation of Micolash's last line after we got him down to half health, I used the plural nightmares instead of the official the nightmare. I did this to illustrate how, in isolation, it's possible that Micolash was talking about the nature of nightmare realms in general. Given the full context of the game, though, we know a few things that suggest a different understanding of the Japanese. First, consider where we found Micolash's mummified corpse. It was at the head of a number of dead individuals in the Unseen Village, presided over by the School of Mensis. This makes it likely that he would be an important figure in that particular church faction. We also know that the name of this area is the Nightmare of Mensis, which is a fairly straightforward translation of the Japanese. Finally, Micolash's full boss name is Host of the Nightmare, and here the Japanese word for host can also be understood as master. More on that later. For now, the thing to note is that this particular nightmare is essentially Micolash's home turf. It also seems likely that he can exert some special control over it, as demonstrated by his ability to warp through mirrors and reanimate puppet corpses. In light of all that context, then, the idea that he would appeal to his control of this specific nightmare seems much more likely than that of him making a general statement about nightmare realms. It also seems almost certain that the nightmare he is identified as the host of is this Nightmare of Mensis, meaning the more general meaning of Nightmare Master is probably inaccurate as well. What I find remarkable about this consistency is that while this interpretation may seem straightforward in the full context of the game, it's just the sort of thing that's likely to trip up a translator working without any reference. Granted, it's not impossible to connect Micolash's title of Host of the Nightmare to the Nightmare of Mensis using textual information alone, but boss names and location names might have been translated separately, to say nothing of dialogue. What's more, I can imagine different translators being assigned to one or another of these categories, so I'm glad this particular connection made it through. Speaking of connections, though, there is another potential link this boss name has to a note found early in the game. Remember way back in episode 5 of Translationborne when we found a note in a small study just beneath Erden Chapel? It made reference to a lost master, and in Japanese, the word used for master in that piece of writing also appears in Micolash's boss name. But just because a word gets reused in one language doesn't mean it should necessarily be repeated in another, so I want to examine how this term appears in each context and consider the implications. Right away, though, we run into a problem. That's because neither Micolash's title nor the text of the lore note is ever voice-acted, and the original kanji has several different readings. This means we can't be sure how it's meant to be read in either instance, let alone whether it's supposed to be pronounced the same way both times. Considering the way it's used grammatically, though, I'd say the most likely possibilities are either aruji or nushi. Fortunately, the meanings associated with each pronunciation are fairly similar, and tend to involve a sense of importance or authority. For instance, aruji has 4 different definitions in my Daijisen Japanese dictionary. The first is the head of a household, the second is the leader of a group, the third is the owner of something, and the fourth is the host of a party. Nushi shares many of these senses, like that of a leader or the owner of something, but adds a few more. For example, it might be used for a person who is responsible for something, like the source of a rumor. Alternatively, it can refer to a person or animal who's dwelt in a place for so long they can derive a sort of spiritual power from their environment, as well as exercise a level of control over it. Personally, I think that last definition is a good fit for Micolash's boss title. He spent so long in the Nightmare of Mensis that he not only knows it well, but he's able to exert some influence over it. The trouble is how to get this across in English, since, as far as I know, there's no one term that captures this idea in the same way. If you call him the Master or Lord of the Nightmare, for instance, that implies a total level of control that isn't really accurate. The official Host of the Nightmare is good for getting across that the nightmare is his home and he's the chief figure in it, but it can easily be taken to refer to a host-parasite relationship, which doesn't fit the Japanese. Whatever you make of the nuance of Micolash's boss title, though, one thing I think is clear is that the term isn't used the same way in the lore note. There, it seems to be referring to the leader of a group. But this isn't to say that there's no connection to Micolash. After all, the same kanji is used, and there are other pieces of writing in the note that are suggestive. Most notable is the mention of all manner of rituals, which is straightforwardly arayuru gishiki in Japanese, because this seems like a clear reference to the rituals being performed by the Mensis sect that are revealed once Ram, the Bergenworth spider, is defeated. Where things really get confusing, though, is the description of the master who the Bergenworth spider is also concealing. That's because this is another instance of a kanji being used that could have two different readings, only in this case the associated meanings are quite different. Back in Translationborne episode 5, I interpreted this descriptor as meaning unable to be seen, and that may well be correct if the kanji is meant to be read as mienu. However, if the alternate reading of mamienu is used, the meaning changes to the negative form of the phrase have audience with. In other words, this leader could be understood as either being invisible or unmeetable. If it's the former, this master might be taken as referring to the invisible amygdala outside Erden Chapel, or even the formless Great One Erden, since the one becomes visible upon defeating Ram, and the most prominent action of the latter only occurs after the revelation of the Red Moon. On the other hand, if the unmeetable or lost meaning is the intended one, that lines up pretty well with Micolash's current state. After all, he seems to be a leading figure in the school of Mensis, and his consciousness is in a nightmare that's inaccessible until Ram is defeated and the secret rituals are revealed. So that's a lot to take in, but what it breaks down to is this. The Japanese version of the note we find in Erden Chapel may contain a reference to Micolash, an amygdala, or Erden as the writer's unmeetable or invisible leader. Meanwhile, Micolash's boss title identifies him as the chief figure to inhabit the Nightmare of Mensis, and the Japanese term that describes him this way uses the same kanji that identifies the leader in the note. Given that, the question is, should the translation of the term in Micolash's title match that used in the note to preserve this potential connection in English? For my part, I'm not convinced it should, even ignoring practical issues like how the notes were probably added after the boss name was already finalized. If you feel differently, though, or have any other feedback for me, please let me know. And until next time, thanks for watching, everyone.